this is what's really amazing. Jesus was crucified. We know no one could find the body. And obviously, you remember there was two garments, right? There's the shroud and then what's called the face cloth, right? Remember, it's related in the Gospels. Well, in 525, they were repairing a wall in Edessa, which is just north of the Jerusalem area in what's now Turkey, but Greece in those days. They found what we now know as the Shroud of Turin, and they called it the face of Jesus. And this image is from 525, which is exactly, this image here is 525, it's exactly what the paintings were later and what we see on the Shroud of Turin. Because prior to that, if you look at paintings and mosaics, prior to 525, they had Jesus looking like a Roman boy. They didn't know he had a Jewish rabbi look. They didn't know he had a beard. And this is a phylactery that the Jewish rabbis wear and the long hair. That's all on the image of the Shroud of Turin. And they didn't know that prior to 525 because the shroud had been lost, right? So then, this is even better. This is from 692 Justinian coin, okay? And it even has the fold. Remember that first slide we had? He's including that in the coin. So clearly the artist saw the Shroud of Turin in 692. And look at the face, the nose, it all matches. They now can do computer matching. It all matches that 692. So that fold feature, see there's a kind of a negative of it. That's the fold feature. He incorporated it onto the coin of Justinian. How could he have done that unless he was looking at the shroud? And this kind of is a composite of them. So here's one from the 4th century fresco. Here's one from the 6th century mosaic, 6th century icon, 11th century mosaic, 12th century mosaic, 13th century icon, 11th century mosaic. So clearly this now became after, so this is the 6th century, the one you saw prior. 6th century, that rough drawing was from 525. This is what you now started seeing after 525. So clearly predates 1532, Fire of Chambray. This is the Prayer Codex, which is a Hungarian book. It was a Hungarian prayer book, and it was created between 1192 and 1195. And here's something that we need to look at very carefully. If you notice on the hands, you only see 4 fingers. And why is that? Because when you drive a nail through the wrist, and in those days they only had a word for hand, they didn't have a name for wrist, so they called the wrist was the hand and the wrist. You drive a nail through there, you get the median nerve and it causes your thumb to curl over. So they clearly saw what's on the Shroud of Turin in 1192, and here's the herringbone design on the Shroud of Turin. And this is dated back to 1192. And this is actually a picture I took. I was fortunate enough to go to the Hagia Sophia. Here's what's on the Hagia Sophia, what we see on the Shroud of Turin. And in fact, they called it so in 932, remember the Muslims then started conquering the Holy Land, and so the fame of the face cloth of Jesus, the face of Jesus, the portrait of Jesus from Edessa was famous. It had fallen under Muslim hands, so they went down in I think it was 945 or 953 in the 900s. They went down and took the shroud to Constantinople, and that's why that's in the Hagia Sophia. And they would do presentations. It was on this complicated mechanism where they'd show the full body length of the Shroud of Turin, and that's why all those paintings and everything from the 10th and 11th century show now what we know is the face of Jesus. What's fascinating is in 1204 is the Fourth Crusade, and the Shroud of Turin disappears. What happened in the Fourth Crusade? The Fourth Crusaders sacked Constantinople, and the Knights Templar were part of that, okay? So what happened is that they had an armory, and they had several, they're based in France, but they had an armory in England, and we'll get into the story there beyond that. But in the armory in England, the legend in England was that the Knights Templar worshipped a bearded man. And they finally discovered, I think it's only about 10 years ago, they discovered the image. It's this image. So the Knights Templar are the ones that took the Shroud of Turin. And then it got to the Grand Knight of the Knights Templar, Geoffrey de Charnay, who was executed by King Louis XIV, I think, who was executed by him. And then his grandson inherited the Shroud of Turin. And at that point, they moved it to Turin, which prior at that point was part of France and then became part of Italy. So that's how the Shroud of Turin ends up in Italy. It was because it was taken by the Knights Templar in 1204, made its way through France, and then became part of the Savoy family and ended up in Turin, Italy, which was part of France at the time. So that's the known history we have of the Shroud of Turin.